Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I'm your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 139, recording on Monday, January 5th, and the Viking season is over. We're going to talk all about the end today on this episode of the show. If you're new here watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or iHeart or wherever you get your podcast, you can rate and review, and that stuff helps us out. Again, going to talk about the game Sunday, and then going to segue into a lot of topics that we will be chewing on this week, next week, and the weeks and months to come, related to quarterback, related to staff, related to aspects of this team and the organization. So had a bunch of you guys submit questions on social media. Got a lot of good ones, a lot of them about similar subjects. And we're going to hit as much as we can here on this Monday evening. As always, this show is presented by First Resource Bank. If you don't know about First Resource Bank, peel your eyes and you will find a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area that has branches everywhere and it's run by really good people. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson, great guys, big fans of the team. They had a lot of emotions navigating these 17 games, as I'm sure you guys did too. But their banking platform is phenomenal, so highly recommend First Resource. Any information you need on how to set up an account is in the link below in the description of this video or podcast. So we'll just start with a little bit from Sunday and kind of my thoughts exiting U.S. Bank Stadium in my puffy coat and gloves as we are well into the winter here. But it was a wild one, like most of these games have been throughout much of the season. I mean, the first half, Clayton Tune stood zero chance, obviously, against Brian Flores' defense. And then I thought J.J. McCarthy was pretty up and down in many ways how he looked for much of the season. Like you saw the competitiveness on that first drive bleed over a little bit into like losing his composure with, not just directly running out of bounds and then jawing at Keyshawn Nixon after the play. And we could litigate, how much, you love the competitive fire and you need that for certain guys to be gamers, but also you don't want to ruin a drive. And there are both sides of the fence there. And I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions. I'm not really going to wade into that very much, but I do want to focus really more than anything else on how I thought he looked as a passer in the game. To me, not as calm in the pocket, and this is going back and watching the film and obviously having conversations with people, but not as calm in the pocket as he'd been from a footwork perspective against Dallas, against Washington, against New York in the first half. Just looked like, him into his drops. He was kind of all over the place in terms of angles and then didn't have much balance at the top of drops, seemed to kind of be looking to scramble a little bit more. And then, just some interesting decisions. The lack of touch and layering continued to kind of show up a little bit. And then there would be throws that were really impressive, like the sideline throw on the run, full speed to Ben Sims, highly impressive. Then you got the red zone sequence where, if the Vikings are playing and you got to win this game to make the wild card, they're probably running Jordan Mason again in that sequence, but they decide to throw. It felt like he was late and inaccurate to the pass to Jordan Addison to deep right side of the red zone. Like maybe he tried to dirt that screen to Ty Chandler, or maybe he just, spiked the throw. Just a lot of, inconsistency, I would say, from a passing game perspective. And, especially with JJ in terms of the way he played. This is the complicated aspect of evaluating everything with JJ McCarthy is, well, how much of some of his inaccuracies, inconsistencies, lack of comfort was because he was navigating pain in the right hand? Like, that's a hard question to answer. He had 2 full days of practice. The Vikings obviously were confident enough that he could go out there and perform, and he was too. So it's hard to really analyze. You could do that with probably every position. Like, that guy's playing with a nagging injury, so he didn't play as well. I mean, it's tough to wade into those waters, and really that's part of the complexity of trying to put a period or an exclamation mark on anything that we've seen in terms of like just the entire season in general. So, that's kind of, that was my takeaway. And then as far as the injury, I mean, you go back and watch the TV copy of the game, and you'll see after the red zone sequence in the first half, he comes to the sideline. He's kind of keeled over, sitting next to Josh McCown. Looks like Josh, the quarterback's coach, is asking him, "Are you good? Like, what do you want to do?" And JJ's kind of shaking his head. And then he comes back out for the second half, throws that first pass, had enough velocity on it, and then immediately waved over. And that was kind of that. There was the towel over the hand. He was holding it behind his back and high-fiving guys with his left hand. Ben Lieber, former Vikings player, and obviously he's been on this podcast multiple times, had some thoughts about, the emotions of it all. And it's, again, even this, it's hard to go back and forth. You want, on one hand, you'd prefer maybe not so much of the show of it, but at the same time, part of the learning lesson that the Vikings wanted him to take from the Giants game was, if you feel something, don't jeopardize the team. And so he felt something, obviously, and he pulled himself out. It's, again, you go down any road with J.J. McCarthy in this season, and you kind of get to the end, and you're like, well, but this, but that. But he played well, from weeks 14 to 16, but that was against some of the worst defense in the NFL. Yeah, but he showed growth. But then in week 18, he was jittery in the pocket. But maybe that was because, again, you can spin yourself into, just cycles with trying to come away with a definitive view of what J.J. McCarthy was, what he will be from this season, and that complicates things into an offseason and into another season where, Justin Jefferson, entering his 7th season, hasn't won a playoff game with the Vikings. Kevin O'Connell, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, neither have won a playoff game with the Vikings, and this will be 2026 will be their 5th season at the helm. So, it is a complex situation. It is a murky evaluation. It is compounded by, obviously, what was not able to happen from the rest of the quarterback room standpoint, and that leaves this offseason with massive uncertainty at quarterback, which almost at this point now, having covered this team for 4 seasons, feels like the natural state of you arrive in January and February, and you got to have the question about what's going to happen at quarterback. It just feels like how it is when you cover this team. Going to get right into questions here, and we'll go a lot of different routes with quarterback, which is where we'll start. We'll talk about Brian Flores, talk about other candidates, etc., and we'll do that right now. All right, we're going to get right into questions, and the first one comes from Cade Delisle, who listens a ton and asks questions almost every week. So we appreciate that immensely. Always gets the brain going. But here's the full question from Cade. Happy New Year, Alec. Appreciate that, Cade. You too, and everyone listening. Happy New Year. Which is more likely at this moment? A big swing for a Pro Bowl level quarterback, or trying to sign/trade for a veteran quarterback to pair/compete with McCarthy next year? Example, Trubisky or Brissett. So I would say, this is potentially a cop-out answer to this question, but the most likely scenario, in my opinion, sitting here right now on Monday evening, January 5th, and it's fluid, I'll tell you that, but the most likely is probably striking the middle of those two worlds, or trying to strike the middle of those two worlds, where you're finding a player who isn't Pro Bowl level, but maybe has the potential in a certain environment, but also is not journeyed enough, journeyed as much as the Trubisky and the Brissett, where you feel like you have the very refined kind of ceiling capped feel of what they are. That's kind of what I'd say. The challenge with this entire conversation, and the one that I guarantee you I will be reiterating and talking about relentlessly over the next few weeks / months, is it possible to strike that middle and find that option without guaranteeing the starting job to that potential candidate? And what I mean by that is, rarely is a starter level player, which is the type of player the Vikings want to covet, rarely is that type of quarterback going to sign with the idea that, you're a starter level player, but we're not sure if you're going to be the starter here, so come on in and compete and we'll see how it goes. That's just not typically how it works. Like, Daniel Jones was a really, really good option that kind of hit this middle last offseason. And part of the reason he eventually signed with the Colts was because it was abundantly clear at that time that the Colts were essentially willing to move off of Anthony Richardson. And I'd say here locally in Minnesota, nothing has been abundantly clear that the Vikings are ready to dispose of the opportunity that they've given J.J. McCarthy. Now, depending on what type of candidates exist, like potentially that is a road and an avenue that we will go down at some point. But that is the central challenge of trying to find something in this middle ground. If it existed, then there would be a lot of teams probably seeking this middle ground. I mean, even Sam Darnold 2 years ago, part of the reason he chose Minnesota and not Denver at the time was because it was pretty clear that he was going to get to start from the outset to provide developmental time for J.J. McCarthy. And so even a guy like that, who was, again, like Daniel Jones, younger player, had shown flashes, had a professional in terms of how he approaches things, some potential upside to lead you to more production than he'd showed in the past. Like, even to get a guy like that in your building, there had to be some kind of declaration that he was going to get a really, really, really good opportunity to start from the beginning of the season. And that's kind of how that happened. I mean, as I wrote on Sunday night after the game, I mentioned this conversation, and if you continue to go down the road of like, okay, so who fits the middle ground of this? And maybe you want to talk about like the Kirk Cousinses, or even the Daniel Jones this time, or the Mac Jones, or what have you. I mean, like, first of all, like, if you were to take the idea of Kirk Cousins, who's to say that he's not going to have a better opportunity somewhere else that is more palatable just from a situational perspective? If it's Daniel Jones, I mean, how much faith can you have in a guy coming off of a torn Achilles? That obviously contributed to the team's decision to move off of Kirk Cousins a couple of years ago. So, that is why, striking this world is so, between those two worlds is so difficult. It's why once Daniel Jones chose Indianapolis last offseason, it became such a difficult, conversation, and it became such a difficult player to try to acquire. Is like, how do you find that type of candidate? And at that point, once Daniel Jones chose Indianapolis, none really existed. Like, there was the Aaron Rodgers route, which he would come in and be the starter, or there was the worst type of route, which was the Sam Howell, which turned into Carson Wentz. And so can you kind of thread the needle on these worlds without guaranteeing somebody the opportunity to start? I'm not so certain you can. And so that's really probably the roundabout way that I'd answer that question. I'm going to go further here on that conversation by answering this one from Purple Rain Vikings at Rain_Vikings. What quarterbacks could the Vikings be looking at potentially? So, I wrote this in the story Sunday night at The Athletic, where I do my day job covering this team. But there's nothing off the table. Like, if you threw an option at me, I wouldn't push back and dismiss it entirely, because from my understanding, the Vikings aren't going to push back or dismiss any option entirely. And that's why I wrote it like I did. And in the past, while I've done this podcast and mailbags and certain things, you get questions about trade candidates that often seem outlandish. And in this specific situation, not really anything seems outlandish to me. What I would say, to the question of what quarterbacks the Vikings could be looking at, the vein that I would view it in is what type of player can be really accurate, what type of player has a level of field vision that Kevin O'Connell often talks about, what type of player has the arm to get the ball downfield, which is what this passing game is kind of geared towards, and then which type of player has the level of professionalism that you would trust to come in here and have faith that they could potentially make the playoffs and win a playoff game. It's hard to find options that align with all of those, but you obviously start with the most premium of those options, and that would be the Joe Burrows, the Lamar Jacksons, the Matthew Staffords. Now, the question that you guys would ask, and that you should ask, the questions that I ask in my seat would be, why would any of those three guys become available? Joe Burrow obviously has been very frustrated this season and in recent seasons with how that team's inability, in Cincinnati's inability, to push deep into the playoffs the way they did, obviously, early in his time there. Lamar Jackson, his contract situation is interesting. There were some negotiations, it sounds like, with the Ravens prior to last season. Those didn't result in an extension, and he's kind of going to hit a point in this offseason where I expect those conversations to continue. And then what happens with those conversations, maybe that would lead to, at some point, him becoming available. Matthew Stafford, this guy's an MVP candidate. Is he going to ride off into the sunset depending on what happens with the Rams? Even if he doesn't, his dead cap comes with a major hit for the Rams this upcoming offseason. Why would they move off of him? So, those are probably the three most premium options that you'd be looking at, and it's hard to conceptualize ways in which those players would be available, even for a very premium cost. If it's not one of those guys, you're talking about quarterback options, then you're asking the question, what is Baker Mayfield's availability? Mac Jones, what is his availability? Does he give you the level of floor that you feel like you can make the playoffs and win a playoff game with? Would you be willing to try to resuscitate Geno Smith's career for the second time? And then again, it leads you back to the realm of the Aaron Rodgers, the Kirk Cousins, the Daniel Jones, and then the Kyler Murray opportunity. But Kyler Murray comes with a bunch of questions from a system fit, from a commitment perspective, the professionalism. Don't believe he's won a playoff game. So would you have the faith that he would be able to do that here? Again, this is a complex conversation with a lot of tentacles and a lot of boxes to check, which kind of underscores, underlines, bolds, italicizes the delicate nature of the dance that the Vikings are going to embark on. That's just kind of the easiest way that I know to say that. The next question comes from Chase Allen. What does the timeline look like for when the major offseason moves typically happen across the league? Coaching decisions, trades, etc. So I'd say the coaching stuff is, it's rampant right now, both from the head coaching perspective, and then, you guys may or may not know this, but obviously as a lot of these coaching vacancies occur and coaching interviews occur, so much of the conversation within some of these interviews, when a coach goes in to pitch themselves on the head coaching candidacy, is, who are going to be my coordinators? What is the staff going to look like? And so a lot of the movement and machinations from a coaching perspective are happening right now. Trades typically probably more likely around early March when teams have to decide on a lot of the contract situations as far as, to absorb certain guarantees. You got to decide by certain dates. And if you've made particular decisions, that often can lead you down the road of being convicted on what to do moving forward. So a lot of this stuff, you're talking late February. That's where a lot of the coaching staffs are finalized. You're talking early March leading into free agency. But the groundwork for any of this stuff, it can be laid at any point. You'll have the Senior Bowl at the end of the month, East-West Shrine game, kind of similar time. That's where a lot of the executives will be. A lot of the coaching staffs will be. That's where dinners can happen, meetings can happen, etc. And so I'll look this up real quick. But when the Rams traded Jared Goff to the Lions, that was, let's see, the timeline of that, if you go back, that, the Lions completed the trade that sent Stafford to the Rams for Goff and 3 draft picks, including 2 first-rounders. That was March 17th of 2021, which is sensible given the timeline, and I imagine some of the groundwork had obviously been laid probably prior to that. So, that's kind of the best way to outline things. And I will just tell you from my standpoint, like, everyone passes along, whether it's friends, family, fans, listeners like you guys, readers, it's like, hope you get some vacation. There will be some rest time, but these next few weeks / months will determine kind of the future of things. And so you got to stay on top of it as much as possible. And that's what I plan to do. Certainly. Next question comes from Zach Moore. Zach asks, do you think they make a decision on Jordan Addison already this offseason, whether it be a trade or an extension? So I will say the Vikings are going to have to make a decision on his 5th-year option. I'd be pretty surprised if the Vikings did not pick that up. Jordan Addison and his season, it really kind of flew somewhat under the radar, but just not the season you would have hoped from him coming off the training camp he had and in his 3rd season as a pro when he's navigated some of the off-field stuff that he's navigated over the last couple of off seasons. He turns 24 here soon, so he's still obviously a very young player. Caught 42 passes for 610 yards. His drop rate was astronomical this year. I was looking at that earlier. Yeah, 6 drops this season, had 5 in the 2 previous seasons combined, and the drop rate was 7.6%. Now, how much of that was, can you place on him? How much of that was the catchability, some of the passes from J.J. McCarthy? Just like the conversation at the beginning of this podcast, depending on your view of the world, of Vikings world, I'm sure you have strong opinions on who you're placing the blame of that to be on. All I know is, there were certain passes this year that I definitely expected Jordan Addison to make that he didn't. And I also feel like the inconsistency of timing and rhythm of the passing game maybe made some of those passes more droppable than they were in previous seasons. As far as Jordan Addison and an extension or trade, the trade is always, the question is always, what is the potential return on a trade to be willing enough to listen? And then as far as an extension, just coming off this season, unless Jordan Addison really wants to secure money and take a team-friendly deal, it'd be hard for me to imagine that the Vikings wouldn't watch another season play out before really assessing kind of what to do with his future, his eventual value, how he manages this offseason, how he shows up in the summer and training camp, if he shows up for voluntary workouts, all that stuff. For me, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and this front office and really the coaching staff too, they always talk about wanting to have as much data as possible before making the sharpest and most educated decision. And so with Jordan Addison, for me, that would probably be to see how this next year goes, and in every capacity as a major evaluation point. As Jordan Addison is a year older and you would hope a year more mature just in how he goes about his work and his process and everything. Next question comes from Skull Warrior. Let me see. I've got it right somewhere in here. Skull Warrior asks the question, do you get the sense that people in the building think JJ needs to grow in his emotional maturity? I think both on and off the field, he could do a lot for himself if he improves there. Obviously, the play on the field is what matters most. I do think emotional maturity is one of the areas that must improve this offseason, just like I think physical improvement, both from a strength perspective, but also a mechanics perspective and how he throws the football. I think those needs improvements. And then I think the mental aspect of seeing the field, making decisions, playing within rhythm, like that needs significant improvement as well. And J.J. McCarthy himself cited physical, mental, and emotional branches as elements of growth that he's going to be after this upcoming offseason, and they all need significant improvement. I mean, I'm not going to belabor the conversation or go off on a tangent on the conversation about J.J. McCarthy's emotional maturity, but there's no question you'd prefer not to be having to teach lessons about stepping out of bounds or not jawing at certain players or, not celebrating before you're in the end zone. Like, those are not conversations when you're developing a young quarterback. Those are conversations you hope you don't have to have because of the amount of focus that needs to be on the very relevant and difficult conversations of just playing the quarterback position in the NFL. So I say all that, and I will pair it with this. I mean, I was just in the locker room for locker room clean out, and players are in there tossing their clothes and their shoes in trash bags. And I mean, Will Fries said he loved playing with J.J. McCarthy. Brian O'Neill said he's excited for J.J. McCarthy's future and his growth and development. So I wrote this for Tuesday, but from start to finish, like, all of the players in the locker room said all the right things. And it's just going to be the responsibility of J.J. McCarthy to prove significant growth in all areas with his actions. Like, that's more than anything else. Like, I mean, when he's back on the field in the spring, when he's on the field in the summer, like, all he can control and how he approaches the offseason, all he can control is to maximize everything about himself in all three of those areas. And the decisions the Vikings make are obviously beyond his control. So that's how I'll answer that one. The next one comes from Minnesota Sports Fanatic at Vikings FB Chat. Who do you think will be cut this offseason as cap casualties? So 4 names immediately surface in my mind. 2 are pretty obvious. 2 are less obvious, but still very relevant to talk about. The 2 pretty obvious ones, Javon Hargrave and Ryan Kelly. Both obviously kind of short-term bets for the 2025 season that didn't pay dividends. If the Vikings were to cut Javon Hargrave, they'd save $11 million on the cap for 26. And if they were to cut Ryan Kelly, they would save around $8.7 million, $8.75 million in cap space for 2026. The less obvious ones that still are sensible in some capacity, Aaron Jones at running back and TJ Hawkinson at tight end. Those guys combined, if they were to be cut, would save around $17 million. I mean, look, both guys are well respected in the locker room. Aaron Jones has been the beacon and pillar, really, one of the pillars of just reliability for Kevin O'Connell in terms of his connections within the locker room and in terms of just, trust within the offense. But you look at all the advanced metrics of Aaron Jones' season, it was not a spectacular year. He didn't play the full season. He's a year older. It would make sense probably for the Vikings to get younger at that position. And then at tight end, it's really a difficult evaluation with TJ Hawkinson because of how much he had to help the pass protection unit earlier in the season. But then, his inability at times to make contested catches, obviously he's a couple years removed now, a year and a half removed now from that really brutal ACL tear, after the hit from Kirby Joseph. So would TJ Hawkinson be willing to take a pay cut? Are the Vikings seeking another option there? We'll see. Like, just for example purposes, if you were to cut all four of those players, you'd save around $37 million on the cap, and the Vikings right now are projected around $38 million over the cap. So that would get you right around even, and then there are a lot of restructures that could happen to offer more cap space to use on certain needs, whether it's safety, whether it's cornerback depth, whether it's defensive line, etc. Like Justin Jefferson's contract could be pushed back. Christian Darrisaw's, Brian O'Neill is ending the final year of his deal, and I'll get to him in a second. Jonathan Grenard, I want to look at his deal real quick while I'm with you guys. Jonathan Grenard has guaranteed money into 2027, so nothing is paramount into this season, but perhaps he seeks something. I mean, who knows there? So there are a lot. Andrew Van Ginkel's money could be moved back. Jonathan Allen's contract could be a little bit reworked. So there's a lot of avenues to then go from $40 million over to potentially $30 million with money to spend, which would obviously offer some flexibility. The next question is about Brian O'Neill, and it comes from Douglas McClure, who I always appreciate listening and reading, etc. What's the future, Brian O'Neill? No guaranteed money left and entering a contract year. Do you think an extension is likely? I definitely wouldn't rule it out as far as Brian O'Neill. I mean, this guy is like one of the premier voices inside the Vikings locker room. He is, the beacon of consistency in terms of playing through injuries. His one major injury this season was, in many ways fluky. He had to play a special team snap on a kickoff on a field goal because of injuries at offensive line. One of the players lands on his knee, and that becomes an injury. But the other aspect of Brian O'Neill is you want certainty at tackle, and the hope, obviously, internally is Christian Darrisaw gets back full, is practicing full, is playing at the elite level that you guys and obviously me covering this team had become accustomed to him playing at before the injury in Week 8 of 2024, I believe. So having Brian O'Neill and solidifying that right side would be pretty critical. He'll turn 31 years old next year, but among guys that this team would believe in to push into the future and get older and still maintain his ability, Brian O'Neill would be one, just with his smarts, his technique, and just kind of how long he's done it. So you definitely wouldn't be surprised to see something like that, Douglas. Next question comes from Sam Paco. Who do you see as the most likely options to replace Brian Flores in the event he leaves for a head coaching job or another defensive coordinator job? Very worthwhile conversation, I would say. It's a massive one. Like, I cannot say enough how important Brian Flores' defense was to preventing this season from becoming just an absolute nightmare. Like, the Vikings defense finished third in DVOA, and last year were second in DVOA. And from a talent perspective, like, there's at cornerback, it still has not been an elite unit, and really scheme and pressure has prevented the corners from having to do a lot of the dirty work. So what would happen if you got elite corner? What would happen if you found an interior defender that really was a presence besides Jalen Redmond? So it's a real interesting conversation. I will say just briefly, as far as the head coaching situation with Brian Flores, it's tough to thread the needle on which option would be the most sensible, like Vegas is probably the one for a lot of reasons. One, his relationship with Tom Brady. Two, the defensive coordinator in Las Vegas, Patrick Graham, and Brian Flores are best friends, so that's another facet. And then if you're trying to transform culture and have a certain standard, be all about winning, like Brian Flores would definitely probably do that. And then as far as defensive coordinator, I mean, I expect any team with a defensive coordinator opening or any head coach or head coach candidate getting a new job should push as aggressively as possible to have Brian Flores as their defensive coordinator, which would only increase the price of what the Vikings would have to pay. And I mean, similar to like paying a massive quarterbacks, to have shelled out $344 million for 2025 and receive the results of no playoff attendance or opportunity, and then have to pay even more for a coordinator with some of the uncertainty. I mean, look, I wouldn't put it past the Vikings ownership is going to, I'm sure pony up to pay as much as possible for Brian Flores, but the price will be the price. There's no question about it. As far as the question, the original question, as far as candidates, I've said this many times. If you're talking about internal candidates, the two most obvious ones are Durante Jones, who's been the DB's coach and passing game coordinator, and then Mike Saravo, who's been the linebackers coach. Like those two guys have called plays in training, in training camp throughout the preseason, and those two guys, have the respect of players already in the room. I will say this. I was listening to a quote from Curt Cignetti the other day. Curt Cignetti, the Indiana coach, and he was talking about Corey Heatherman, who is the Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator. And if you don't know, Indiana plays Miami. Heatherman had been a DC under Cignetti, so there's a lot of familiarity there. But Cignetti was talking about hiring Heatherman, and the one thing he talked about that he really liked was kind of the disposition and the presence that Heatherman had, and how much he felt like Curt Cignetti felt like that would flow to the entire unit. And that is critical to me as I think about, like, if the Vikings were to lose Brian Flores, you would be losing a serious presence. And so finding someone who could come in with that, in my opinion, would be really critical. I mean, some guys who would make sense. Jonathan Gannon, I know he and Kevin O'Connell have gotten along in the past. Jonathan has been here. He was obviously recently fired from Arizona. They've done some really interesting things in Arizona over the last couple of years defensively, been very creative, been hard to handle. And his DC, Nick Rallis, I wouldn't be surprised if that, Nick gets another DC job as well. So, like, those two names, Raheem Morris and the relationship, obviously, that Kevin would have with Raheem from his time in Los Angeles. If Brandon Staley, who's been down in New Orleans, was available, that would be another name on the top of my mind. But obviously, it would be a massive, massive conversation to have here locally amid all of the other ones. And I've been saying this now for a month and a half, that if you were to lose Brian Flores, it would create a level of uncertainty that would just add to the pile of it that already exists. Next question, Carl Johnson. Non-Vikings palate cleanser. You move from the Royals beat to the Vikings. Is that rare for athletic writers to change sports? I thought, like Russo, maybe you specialize in one, or is it more common? I don't know if it's rare. Like Peter Baugh, who was a colleague of mine at Mizzou, he covered Missouri football and then transitioned to cover the Colorado Avalanche. So it's definitely possible. Part of the reason I did it was, I wanted, different type of lifestyle from covering baseball, which is just 14 hours a day for 6 months. But also, I love learning about these games. I love the crossover from you take what you learned in one sport and think about it in another sport. Like I still talk to baseball people about how they think about roster construction, team building, and player evaluation and player development and all of that stuff. As a fan of sports, like at my core and like in my heart, it's just cool to get to learn the intricacies of these sports and these leagues and these teams at many different levels. And like the people who know me know, like I love basketball. I always have. And so that's why during the playoffs, like I bothered John Krasinski, my colleague, to get to do some of that stuff because it's just cool exposure for me. And I like the lens at which I, get to view different types of sports and games and stuff like that. Let's see. We'll do a couple more and then hop out of here. Jason Ring asks, after 4 years of seeing Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell work together, do you sense a tension between them, or do you think personally they still have the same vision? After this year's quarterback decisions has me believe they both wanted different options. What I would say this is the jobs are different, okay? When you're a GM, you have to look up, you have to, have your mind centered on this present season and the seasons into the future and how to manage the present and the future. When you're the head coach of the team, like much of your responsibility is to win right now because you're the one who has, you take the accountability after games, during the week, you're in front of the media, you have relationships with players. Like the two jobs are very different. And I've said this and I've written it in the past, like oftentimes they work kind of as like diametric forces in many ways. Not Kevin and Kwesi, but I'm saying those roles in general create different wants, different perspectives. And so that's kind of how I'd answer that question. I mean, as far as the tension, inside the building, I early in the season, I think after the Chargers game, I wrote something about the tension or something about tension. And what I rephrasing that now or thinking about it now, I think the best way I know to describe it is the stress of what the Vikings were attempting to do in 2025 by raising a young quarterback who was very raw and needed growth in the three areas we've already talked about in this podcast, while having a roster that in many ways was built to win right now. Like that was a stressful thing. And it was stressful for people internally in training camp, once the season began, when the team went to Europe, when the team came back from Europe, and to be able to push past that stress and do what this team did the last 5 games of the season is a testament to the coaching, to the fortitude of the leaders in the locker room. And it definitely does say something that the team was be able to kind of push past that down the stretch. But that's how I would phrase that and the way I'd feel most comfortable doing that, certainly. That'll do it for episode 139 of the Alec Lewis Show. Appreciate you guys being here. If you made it all this way, you can hit the subscribe button on YouTube, hit the like button. You can follow us on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, all of that good stuff. We will be back with much more thought and takeaway from this season with a bunch of host of guests. No, we haven't had a ton of late trying to get through the end of this season, but I promise you there is much, much more to come. I will be diving into the draft stuff very deeply, both in terms of my own evaluation and conversations. So stay locked in. We will be here over the next few months. Can't wait to get into some of those conversations. And the show is presented by First Resource Bank. It's sponsored by Unreal. All of my stuff's in the wash, so I don't have it here. But I mean, I've been repping it all season, and we cannot thank them enough for the support to get us through what was a wild 2025. With that, thank you guys for being here, and we will talk to you very, very soon.